Although I was raised in a religious family where no one knew anything about science, I was lucky in that the various adults in my life decided not to indoctrinate children until they reached the age of reason, which they arbitrarily decided to be 8 years old. I think a preacher must have said something like that at some point and everybody just followed suit. But by the time I turned 8, my second grade teacher had already given me a book on dinosaurs that had included, explanations of evolution and dendrograms. So I already knew how evolution worked before any of the pseudoscientists tried to confuse and befuddle me like they always do to crush every child's curiosity and cognizance in their own congregations. How good could your understanding of evolution be if all you ever heard was misunderstood, misrepresented misinformation? Case in point, misguided trolls in my comment section always think that they can challenge me with arguments gleaned from some creationist propaganda site. And this guy, for example, could not understand that a transitional intermediate is not necessarily the same thing as a common ancestor, that these terms have different definitions. So asking for one does not mean getting the other. And I'm not doxing anybody by showing this troll's name. When I told him that I had already screenshotted this thread so that I could make a video to answer his question so that everyone could see that, yes, I did answer his question and that he wouldn't be able to lie about that anymore, he never replied to that post. Instead, the thread disappeared, and so did his YouTube account. So it obviously wasn't his real name anyway. He's just another anonymous internet nobody playing the troll. That explains the total lack of punctuation, which sadly I see from every age group. What else should we expect from religious education, or rather indoctrination, whose primary goal is to mislead and deceive? I told him I had taken the time to write out a satisfactory answer for the moment, and that I realized somewhere in there that I could make another video about this. So I may as well do it, even though the troll has already evaporated. He says,
At Arner Rock, great, you never answered my question.
But you can see that, yes, I did answer his question in the post that he's replying to, and I answered it again in my next reply. Anyway, he continued,
Now, what is a common ancestor that you know of between a giraffe or hippopotamus or sloth or porcupine?
His question is in two parts, so let me deal with them in the order received. I answered him saying, once again, I repeat, we do not name common ancestors. Instead, we identify transitional intermediates. That means the most basal member of the common clade. For example, between giraffes and hippos, both of which are much bigger clades than you imagine, we first combine the family Giraffidae, which includes multiple species of long-necked giraffe and one species of short-necked giraffe, the okapi. Then we combine that family with another family of fossil giraffoids, Climaceratidae, with another half-dozen known species of freakishly weird things that never made it onto Noah's Ark for some reason. Most of these had short to moderate neck length. So that's one of the transitional intermediates you asked about. It's frustrating that there are so many species once upon a time that only paleontologists know about, and that folks who don't know anything about them still think that they know more than all the experts about everything they've never studied. Then we combine Giraffoidea with another fossil superfamily, Paleomericoidea, to form the unified clade Giraffomorpha. This group combines deer and cattle and pronghorns and a couple more extinct groups to form Pecora, the horned ruminants. Tracing further back, we combine Pecora with the clade of mouse deer to establish Ruminantia. That's the even-toed ungulates with divided stomachs for rumination. Tracing further back, we finally combine ruminants with the ancestors of hippos, which also happen to be the ancestors of whales. So we combine the hippo family, Hippopotamidae, with the infraorder of whales, Cetacea, to form Cetancodonta, or Whippomorpha, if you prefer. The parent clade of both groups is Cetruminantia, and one of the most basal members of that clade is Indohyus, which would be another of the transitional intermediates the troll asked about. Now, moving on to sloths and porcupines. Porcupines are rodents. They're a subset of Euarchontoglires, just as we are. So we and porcupines are in a sister group to Laurasiatherians. Those are mammals that evolved on the then combined supercontinent of North America, Europe, and Asia. Laurasiatherians include giraffes and hippos. Combining those two groups gives us Boreoeutheria, which is the sister to Atlantogenata. All eutherian mammals are divided between Boreoeutherians and Atlantogenatids. Atlantogenata is divided between Afrotheria, the mammal group that evolved in Africa, which includes elephants and manatees, among other things, and Xenarthra, the mammal group that emerged in South America. That's the group to which sloths belong. All this can be confirmed genetically, of course, but creationists don't care about evidence because that's just reality, and they don't want anything to do with that. They want to make believe something else instead. So they say that they're not of the world, preferring to pretend that they're from a
world of pure imagination.
Now, onto what is arguably the more important part of the troll's question.
Then tell me, how did the giraffe develop with all the valves in its neck and head when it bends down for a drink? It doesn't have a dizzy, spelling dies. Tell me how all of that mechanism evolved. Then tell me after it was able to manage all of these mechanisms. The first giraffe that died while trying to get these mechanisms perfected when it died. How did it pass experience on to the next giraffe to correct it?
That question, while stupid and rambling, is still interesting because it reflects the way people used to think hundreds of years ago, back in the 1700s, a century before Darwin. Back then, there was this guy named Jean-Baptiste Pierre-Antoine de Monet Chevalier de Lamarck, who proposed the idea that giraffes stretched their necks out over time trying to reach leaves that were higher and higher up in the trees. And the thing is that even if it was possible to stretch your neck out longer, which it isn't, but even if it was, that wouldn't lead to children or offspring born with longer necks. Nonetheless, this was a very popular idea for the next 150 years. Even after Darwin eventually published his explanation, the one that actually works, people still preferred Lamarck's idea for two reasons. One, it didn't challenge anybody's religious beliefs. And two, it appealed to those who like to think that if they worked out with weights, then their children would be born stronger, or if they read all of the books of the great minds, then their children would be born smarter. Ambitious people saw that as taking charge of their own destiny. Hitler, Stalin, and Mao, and many of their contemporaries in the early 20th century loved the idea of Lamarckism, and they all hated Darwinism because where is the glory in being a mutant, in inheriting something random and accidental? Because the wanna pretenders love to pretend that everything happens for a reason. And they would much rather imagine that whatever knowledge and skills they acquired in life would somehow be passed down to their kids, even though we know
It ain't necessarily so.
Another problem with Darwinian theory from a public relations standpoint is that it directly contradicts and disproves traditional interpretations of religious doctrine. And it's a pattern of emergent complexity, which religious fundamentalists seem incapable of comprehending, that only occurs at the population level, having nothing whatsoever to do with the individual. But notice how creationists always imagine that it has to be one individual that undergoes all of these changes in a single lifetime, as if we're talking about X-Men comics or Pokemon. A mutation first appears in an individual, but merely having a mutation is not evolution. It doesn't become evolution until that mutation is inherited by its descendants and then spreads through the entire community over many generations. And in this case, we're not just talking about one significant mutation, but several dozen of them. The scientists found about 70 genes in the giraffe genome that showed adaptations that are not seen in other mammals. 2/3 of these genes code for proteins linked with regulating different aspects of development and physiology, particularly in the skeletal and cardiovascular systems, which of course is what we're talking about now. 4 of them, for instance, are homeobox genes associated with the development of the spine and legs. Natural selection isn't always involved in evolution. In fact, most biodiversity results from genetic drift as a matter of population mechanics. Remember that Darwin's version of evolution not only works, but it's the only one that does work, and it's the only explanation of biodiversity there is, where one ancestral species becomes 2 and then 4 and then 8 daughter groups and so on, excepting for those that eventually go extinct. with each group becoming increasingly distinct from their ancestors or cousins. And so it goes forever, eventually producing profoundly different lineages, all through descent with inherent modification, rather than the creationist distortion of one kind changing into another fundamentally different kind, which is not how evolution works, and there's no such thing as a kind. To better explain what evolution really is, let's say you have a population of giraffes. Some moved up north, some to the south, and then a river or seaway or a wasteland of some kind is formed between them. Maybe a volcano has erupted or someone built a city there, whatever, such that the now divided population is separated and isolated. After several generations, each group continues to build up their own unique mutations that are not shared by any member of the other group, such that they begin to grow apart, and they develop unique distinctions, such that even in just a matter of decades, it could be that if you found a lone wanderer in the no man's land between the two groups, you should be able to tell which group it came from. Is this a northern giraffe or a southern giraffe? Elsewhere, we might find a reticulated giraffe or a Maasai giraffe. All four modern species are products of genetic drift, not natural selection. However, the difference between all of these long-necked giraffes and the okapi or short-necked giraffe is a matter of natural selection. Darwin's explanation was that some giraffes happened to be born with longer necks, and this conferred an advantage in being able to reach higher leaves. And that's true, demonstrably so. But it's not the only reason. We can also apply sexual selection to the giraffe's neck, judging by how the males compete with other males for the attention of females in a style of head bashing, or rather clashing, that works better with a longer neck. Of course, creationists are always trying to find some way to ignore what even they know is true, so they lie and deny all the evidence of giraffe evolution in the fossil record, and they pretend as if Darwin's version of evolution hadn't already provided the only explanation that works. But when you have to make believe what is not evidently true and try to find fault with whatever is true, then when these science deniers saw that there was a second reason given for the evolution of a giraffe's neck, they chimed in to say that that means that the first explanation was wrong. But it's not. They're both correct. One may as well argue as to say whether to say rodeo or rodeo, which is correct. Either one, it's both of them. And there may be others besides that too. Remember that whether they're long-necked or short-necked, all giraffes have only 7 neck vertebrae, just like nearly every other mammal. Exceptions are extremely rare. The difference is that those 7 vertebrae are much longer than normal. So what about the troll's question, how did giraffes develop longer necks which required vascular regulation in the form of venous valves? That when the giraffe bows down to drink, that the blood doesn't rush down to its arteries to pool in its head. How did both of these traits evolve at the same time? Now, before I give you a scientific explanation, let's remember what the creationist explanation is.
A magic man done it.
That's it. That's what they make believe. Of course, that's not an explanation of any kind at all. Saying, I don't know, therefore magic, doesn't explain anything, now does it? Even if it was true, it wouldn't qualify as an explanation. And we know it's not true. The reality is that evolution is a matter of incremental, usually subtle, superficial changes in physical or chemical proportions across whole populations over many generations. So, if early giraffes had slightly longer than normal necks, but with no vascular regulation, they'd have to lower their bodies to drink by spreading their front legs or bending their knees. And giraffes do that. Those who didn't have the super long necks yet also didn't have super long legs yet. So this was already a good way for them to compensate for the possibility of a head rush. Even the short-necked giraffe does that, and it has short legs. But now, why is it just a problem for the blood to pool in the head? Why isn't that also a problem for the legs where the blood would pool in the feet, where the situation would be constant? Well, giraffes already have venous valves in their legs for the same reason that humans do. As we developed bipedal locomotion and longer legs, we needed it to improve the efficiency of our blood flow against gravity. Hooved animals obviously did the same. It's a relatively simple matter for a mutation of Hox genes to take a structure from one part of the body and duplicate it for a similar structure somewhere else. Evolution rarely proceeds in a direction that a particular animal is not already adequately prepared to go. Whales, for example, descended from hoofed animals that already had the type of inner ear that works best in underwater conditions. Otherwise, that lineage might not have been able to go as far as it did. They might have been like so many others that could only go so far and then fade into extinction. There are several lineages like that. In this case, though, we know that giraffes already had venous valves in their necks before they had long necks. We know that because okapis, the short-necked giraffes, have venous valves, because that was already a necessity even for short-necked giraffes. So there's yet another mystery solved. So while the professional fools at the Heads in the Sand Institute like to lie and say that the giraffe's neck is a failed icon of evolution and that evolution can't explain it, we know the fact is that it's yet another mystery that evolution does in fact explain, that it was the first one to provide an explanation, and it's another instance where evolution provides the only explanation.